Hi, and welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show, the show for animal training and behaviour nerds, where I, Ryan Cartledge, interview the world's most proficient animal training and behaviour geeks. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever you're listening to this on so that you don't miss a single episode. Each episode of this show is brought to you on behalf of the ATA membership. And if you like the conversations in this episode, then you're invited to continue them with like-minded behaviour nerds within the membership area, which you can find out more about at www.animaltrainingacademy.com. Once part of the ATA tribe, you'll get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalogue of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help problem solve your training challenges. Plus, we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forum areas. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behaviour geeks. Well, we will get started on today's episode where we will be talking to one Nicolette Canzoneri. Nicolette's academic and professional careers have included all things behaviour, beginning with animal behaviour early on and morphing into her current endeavours with human behaviour. Her background in both human and non-human behaviour converged for her master's degree, which focused on the incorporation of behavioural science in education programming at zoos and aquariums. Nicolette's graduate studies honed her expertise in learning and science communication in non-formal/free choice education settings and helped to refine her skill set in behaviour change. She is an experienced behaviour analyst who is passionate and compassionate about motivating change in the environmental arena. Her strengths include innovative science communication, social science research, training animals of all species, including humans, and creative problem solving. Nicolette currently works at Action Research as the Conservation Behaviour Coordinator and manages a variety of environmental projects that incorporate community-based social marketing, CBSM, to increase their effectiveness. So, without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Nicolette to the show today. She's patiently waiting by. Nicolette, it's great to have you with us, and thank you so much for making time to hang out with us here at Animal Training Academy.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
It's an exciting topic. It's not one that we've really unpacked. Well, I don't have to say we've really unpacked. We haven't unpacked this topic before on the podcast show, specifically with the line of work that you're talking about. And being behaviour nerds, speaking on behalf of you, the listeners, anything that we can apply our science to is of great interest for our nerdy needs. So I'm excited to have this opportunity to learn how you're applying behaviour science to helping to save the world. More about that soon though. To start off with, Nicolette, can you please take us all back to where you got started, where you first learned about positive reinforcement animal training and some of the first animals you ever trained using? Can you share some stories from that time?
Yeah, absolutely. So my journey started way back when I was in high school. I started working at my local zoo and taking care of the animals there. And that led me down the Moorpark path. So I went to Moorpark College and I graduated from there in 2007. And that's when I first really learned about how animal training works and positive reinforcement and all of that fun behavior stuff. And from there, I was so interested in that topic, I decided to do my undergraduate degree in psychology with an emphasis on applied behavior analysis. So I did that up in Northern California. And while I was doing that, I was working at other like wildlife education outreach facilities and really liked being able to work with animals and also the public. So being able to share, my bond and all the cool facts and these stories about these animals. And that was something that was really important to me. I also ended up moving back down to Southern California, where I am now. And I worked at the Navy for the marine mammal program there. So I was training dolphins for reconnaissance, which sounds super fun. And it was really cool. So I've worked with a variety of animals over the course of my animal training career. So marine mammals, land mammals, birds, love ravens. That's my favorite. So that's kind of how that journey started.
And I'm curious to hear, because you went to Moorpark, and we've had lots of people on the show who attended and did the Eton program at Moorpark. Yep. And some of the past podcast guests here at Animal Training Academy were your classmates. The ripples from Anna, Blasphemy and Myrtle have led to you and me being connected. I feel like everyone has a Moorpark story. Some animal or some situation that they remember that really sticks out and provided them a poignant learning opportunity. Is there anything that sticks out for you from your time at Moorpark? And maybe for the listeners who don't know what Moorpark is, are you able to explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. Shout out to all the EDM grads and to Anna. So the Exotic Animal Training and Management Program, or EDM for short, is a very obviously specific program at Moorpark College that teaches people how to be animal trainers and caretakers and to navigate the world of the general animal industry in various roles and capacities. And it's a really intense 2 years where we don't really have days off, and we're cleaning and feeding before classes and then go to class and then clean and feed after, and shows on the weekends and all of that stuff. And I'm sure it's probably, changed over the years, but it's a really great experience. It's also very challenging, probably because of the lack of sleep. And also everyone's really passionate about being there. So we're all trying to squeeze as much as we possibly can out of those experiences. And a couple of my favorite memories or animal times, I suppose, were with the sea lion, which is actually how Anna and I became closer friends, because she was my second year on the sea lion. And then also with a raven. And both of those, I think what was really interesting about that for me was that they were both humbling experiences, because I realized that those animals were way smarter than I was. I recall when I was training the raven, Ebony, I don't even remember what the behavior was, but I had this whole training plan mapped out and it sounded really great on paper, and I would get in with her, and she was like 8 steps ahead of me. So she was already like doing what I thought we were going to do in like 2 weeks, and then also was manipulating me into reinforcing her for things that I shouldn't have been. It was a learning experience. And I thought that was really, there was just a couple of those moments where I was like, oh, this animal gets it way better than I do. And same thing with the sea lion. There was a lot of times where if I wasn't on my game, on my toes, in the moment, very, very present, that, she would just sort of take advantage of that. So I really appreciated those, not just being able to learn how to apply positive reinforcement techniques appropriately, but also that real world, experience as well.
Yeah, I think I've definitely been outsmarted by numerous corvids over the years. So I totally appreciate that. And then you moved back down to Southern California. And whereabouts in this time, and sorry if you've already said it, did you kind of go back and do your master's and fit all of that in?
Well, good question. So I started working at the Navy, and one of the things that I realized as I was working there is that, in all of the other facilities I had worked at previously, we were open to the public. And that's a huge portion of what a lot of animal institutions do, is they are engaging with audiences. And at the Navy, it's the exact opposite, right? So you have to have security clearance and there's no one there. And so we were doing all this really, really interesting training, and we had, these incredible bonds with the animals, and there was so much great husbandry that was happening. But none of that could have been shared with anyone else except for people who were training with you. And it made me think about how important it was to have that audience engagement and to be sharing that relationship that I had with the animals, because to me, that was really the key in driving behavior change, which I will talk about later. That, if people understood what this relationship looked like, or they understood how amazing these animals were, maybe they wouldn't be contributing to climate change or other conservation issues as much as we are. And so I started to think about that. And I thought, wait, do we actually change people's behavior when we are having these presentations and doing these programs where we have animal ambassadors that are supposed to be representing their ecosystems and their other wild counterparts? Do people actually take that information home with them and do something different as a result? And, if I talk to all of my trainer friends or people who are working in the industry, the answer is, of course they are, because we all did, right? Most of us had some experience like that, and then maybe shaped the course of our careers and our future. But I thought about, everyone else. And that's actually what prompted me to go back to grad school. So that's what I ended up studying in my master's. I did my master's at Oregon State University in environmental science, and I focused on free choice learning, which is the learning that occurs outside of outside of formal learning institutions. And that includes zoos and aquariums. And I was really interested in how communication happens within the confines of those types of facilities, but then also how behavior was being targeted. So if we're talking about utilizing our animals, like resources, to impact behavior, how were people doing that? Because I had learned through my undergrad and using all these other, positive reinforcement techniques, that there is a science to behavior. And it's not just that you kind of hope that things will change, right? I mean, nobody walks, I would hope, into an enclosure with an animal without any sort of idea of how that's going to change their behavior. And I think that oftentimes that's what we do with people. So that's what I studied, and I learned all kinds of really interesting things.
And so this change not change, but I guess it is a change. You started to ask different questions. You started to wonder and become curious about what was happening once the visitors left the places that you were employed or other organisations. Was there a moment, you think, where things shifted for you? Where was it? Did you meet someone? Was there a situation where you're like, that you can remember, or was it like a gradual process of you just getting curious? And I'm assuming, tell me if I'm wrong, not being able to find answers.
Yeah. So, it really was being in the environment where I wasn't able to share my experiences with the public, because I started to wonder, I just started to reflect on that being an important part of my career, because like I said, I really enjoyed the training opportunities that I had there, but because it was missing that component, it just started to make me think about it. And so then I started to look into what we knew about how animal ambassador programming impacts behavior, and I wasn't finding anything. And there was a lot of cognitive dissonance, I guess, is really like ultimately what I would say, is because I felt like what I was doing and what I was saying wasn't lining up with maybe what the reality was. And I was really curious to find out that answer. And because there wasn't one, I decided to do research on it myself.
I feel something that I've discovered, something that trainer Steve White taught me, is the value of and a mindset of, I'm going to add my own layers of meaning to it, the mindset of curiosity. And it's something that I feel like I've shifted with significantly over the years. And so I'm getting from you, because I'm curious, like what drives you, what motivates you to go to the links, which are freaking awesome, the links you've gone to like start to ask questions, to go back to university to study, and somehow you've now created for yourself a paid bit of employment where you get to explore these ideas even more. Like how does your mind operate that you can take so much action on that curiosity?
That has to do with how passionate I am about making a positive impact on the planet. I love animals to my core. And I felt like in order for me to do the best that I could, I really needed to understand that. I really needed to understand that aspect of it, right? So to me, I saw like how powerful behavior is, how the science of behavior is able to change what we would normally maybe not be able to change, or outwardly not be able to change, like once you understood it on a different level. And I recognize that one of the big problems with just everything that's happening in terms of like, biodiversity loss and habitat loss and all those things was this human component, right? So if we want to save wildlife, then we need to do something pretty drastic. And I had formed such deep relationships with these animals over the years that I realized that, for me, I guess, I don't know if maybe this is an okay audience to say these things to, but, I realized that they were, for a lack of a better word, they're like people, right? They have personalities and opinions and perspectives, and they can love and do all those things. And I get that, like a lot of that from a science standpoint and Moorpark, yada, yada, yada. But my experience showed that like those animals deserve to be saved, whether or not I knew them. Didn't matter. They just needed to be saved. And so I wanted to do that the most effectively that I could. And because of my background in applied behavior analysis and animal behavior, I knew that there was a way to do that effectively. And when I looked around at all the facilities I had worked at, including, my educational background, there really wasn't an emphasis on how to motivate change with our audiences. How do we motivate change with the public? And because that's the big one, right? If we're all doing the right things, that's great. Like, I don't want to dismiss that, but we need everybody on board, or as many people as we can. So how can we really leverage these incredible animals that we care for in a way that's not only beneficial to the animal, but to the planet? And so that was really my driving force. Is I just wanted to make sure that I was living what I was saying, right? So that's that cognitive dissonance piece where I wanted to make sure that, and I kept saying, oh, the reason why we have these animals in our care is because it changes something and inspires people to do something different. It does these things. I felt like in order for me to truly justify that, I needed to know that that was true. And there was no answer to that.
I can imagine that you potentially, if you're anything like me, get excited about something and then just want to tell everyone. But potentially my imagination about what your situation must have been like, and still I assume is like, is that you kind of go into conversations with people that aren't speaking the same language as you. And I'm guessing at least at some points of your journey, you've had a little bit of a bite back about this, like people saying, we don't need to do this. Like, we're doing our job. We're educating the public. We're making positive change. Like, did that occur? And then how did you kind of navigate your way around that?
Yeah. So I don't know if it's really been an outright pushback, but there certainly is a little bit of this question of, this is the way we've done things. What I'm doing matters. And I don't want to say that it doesn't, because it certainly does, but not necessarily from a behavioral perspective. So a lot of people are putting their heart and souls into the care that they give those animals and into their programming, and they're engaging their audiences, and they're doing great things with that. And they're educating them, which is wonderful, because we need to increase our environmental literacy. Definitely in the United States. I don't know if I can speak to that outside of the US. So all those things are still really relevant and important. But in terms of changing behavior and motivating behavior, we're just not doing it. And I have now empirical evidence of that. It's not just my opinion. But, I have a lot of anecdotal evidence of that, but, also now this empirical evidence. And, I guess the one thing that I want to encourage is that it's not really about it's just like a way we can improve. So if we really want to do the best that we can, we have to look at incorporating behavioral science, social and behavioral science specifically, into programming effectively. And it's really important that we are on the same page, especially as behavioral experts. So, there's typically at zoos and aquariums, there's those two main departments. We have the husbandry department, which is all the animal, people taking care of the animals. And you have the educators and the education department. And a lot of times they're the ones that are designing the program content. And this varies across institutions. This isn't always true, but a lot of times they don't have control over, like the husbandry department doesn't necessarily have control over like what type of education that they're providing. They just do what they're told. And what's interesting about this is that the educators a lot of times don't have the behavioral background that almost all of the animal husbandry people do. And so they're not tapping into this really robust resource within their institutions to be able to capitalize on that knowledge and to start implementing better strategies for addressing behavior. And so that's one of the things that I talked about in my thesis was how to better incorporate both departments so that they can use each other's strengths to build better programming. And the way that I frame that, so I looked at, I don't know if you want me to get into all this, but what I looked at in my thesis is I needed to use some sort of theoretical or conceptual framework to understand what I was looking at. And so I used applied behavior analysis because that's what I knew. And then also this thing called community-based social marketing, which is what I currently focus on at Action Research, because both of those are practical or applied models. And what they do is they allow you to take the science, and the theory, which are not necessarily applied theories or whatever, and make use of them in an appropriate way. And the reason why I use that is because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about how do you practically do these things, because, theories are great, but they're theories. And so people academics, but academics can get way off in la la land sometimes. And they're missing those like practical pieces of like, what are the realities? What are the constraints of trying to implement these things? And what's great about both of these models is that they account for that. And so when I used that lens, I was able to say like, okay, so how can we take, like I said before, like both the education and the husbandry departments, bring them together so that the science, like the real understanding of how the science of behavior works gets translated appropriately into programming that's intended to target behavior, right? So a lot of times people at a zoo or aquarium will have a program where they talk about what people can do when they go home. So they bring out an animal, they talk about, what the plight of that animal is, they give you a bunch of facts. Then at the end, they say, okay, if you were inspired by how amazing this animal is, here is a bunch of stuff that you can do to help this animal. And if that's really the target, if the target really is to get people to do something, you can't just do that. Like, that's just not how it works. Unfortunately, like, I wish this wasn't true. Like, I wish we could just tell people like, yo, do this, and they'll do it, but they won't. I'm sure you can think of plenty of things that you're supposed to do that you don't do. I know a lot of them. I'm supposed to exercise a lot more than I do. Supposed to get 8 hours of sleep or something like that and reduce my stress, blah, blah, blah. But I don't do those things for a variety of reasons.
So the point is, after doing this research, I found that typically zoos and aquariums are not using any sort of behavioral models during the program development process. Instead, they're relying on the awe of the animals and the facts about the animals, as well as information on the issues they face to change behavior, which, as I said, is unfortunately just not how behavior is changed. So it is important for those of us with a deeper understanding of the principles of behavior change to be on the same page and on the same team so we can begin to shift how programs are developed if we want them to actually change behavior.
So the technique of being like, yo, here's a raven, it's real smart, it's black, lives in trees and stuff, go home and recycle. So we're kind of counting on if we're using that, and you can tell me I'm completely wrong here. I'm just riffing off what you're saying. We're just counting on cognitive dissonance on their end, and those people being as curious as you and as passionate as you about wanting to make behaviour change. Then that cognitive dissonance, let me unpack that for anyone who doesn't understand. What I'm trying to suggest is that they have a feeling of discomfort because they know they should be recycling, but they're not recycling. Like, maybe in your opinion you should be doing more exercise, but you're not doing any more exercise. So that kind of makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. So is that kind of what you've found people are expecting, or have you found that people in educational programs and zoos are just expecting that people to be as passionate about animals and wildlife and conservation as we are? Like, what are the challenges to expectations, or what kind of expectations have you come across from people trying to implement behaviour change without potentially the knowledge or skill set to do that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is it's like, that's how we've always done things. So there is this resistance to change, which is pretty normal. And it's also, so information intensive campaigns or education focused campaigns. So things like, here, let me tell you a bunch of things that you should know. They're easy. They're typically pretty quick, and people feel good about them. So they want to do it because they go, well, people just need to know. And that could be true. People do a lot of times have a barrier, which would be knowledge. And so you do need to educate people on certain things. So like, for instance, if you didn't know you were supposed to recycle, and then you heard that you were supposed to recycle, that could definitely play a factor into whether or not you're recycling. But it's just not the only thing, right? So I think a lot of it's just a holdover. It's just been like, well, how do we, not to get really, I do this a lot though, real meta on it, because I try to basically behavior change the whole situation. A lot of it's that they have internal constraints. So it's like, the funding sources are dictating how programs are being developed. Especially executives in a lot of these institutions, if they're not on board with the most up-to-date, most current research on these topics, you have to convince them that this is the direction they need to go. A lot of times there's limited resources in terms of staff, in terms of just material in general, knowledge, all of those things. So there's a variety of reasons why people don't do it. And I think that's why, it's important to talk about this stuff and then try to figure out, which of these issues we can overcome, so that we are able to effectively change. I mean, not to be dramatic, but to effectively change the course of the world. Because, if we don't make a lot of these changes like now, we are going to have really negative impacts. I mean, we're already seeing it. So in my opinion, there's no time to waste. So it's like, okay, we tried this other thing. It doesn't work. It obviously doesn't work because it's not working. So how can we now take steps in the direction, especially when we know there is a better direction to take?
I feel like us and them. I feel like people that have the life experience of learning about applied behaviour analysis and even better practically applying it, understand its applicability to all earthlings and all behaviour. I get a sense that when you're talking about this stuff, you talk a little bit tentatively because you understand it. That we need to do this. We need to focus on behaviour if we want behaviour change. We still frame it as not to be dramatic, even though that it kind of is dramatic. We'd have to define dramatic, but it is that important. But do you feel that kind of you are you've got to be careful about how you word this because you don't want to overwhelm people?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like, being in the industry when I was doing all these things, I know how hard everyone's working and I know how passionate everyone is. And I think that if I heard someone be like, well, you can do this better, I'd be like, you can shove it. You know what I mean? And so I don't want it to come across like that. I think that the unfortunate answer is there's no easy answers for this, right? And the processes that it takes to actually look at the correct behavior, identifying the correct behavior to target, which these are all basically the steps of community-based social marketing. So CBSM, if that's what I say, that's what I mean. in order to do all of those steps, it takes a lot longer on the upfront side than people typically want to do. And it can be a little frustrating because what we're tackling are huge issues. And in order to make measurable changes to behavior, so if we want to see behavior actually changing, we have to break this down into much, much, much smaller pieces. And I think that frustrates a lot of people. And it frustrates me, right? Like I want to be able to go out there and change the world and, snap my fingers and it's done. But that's not how it's going to happen. And so I think there's some resistance to like, how do I have time? Like I already don't have enough time. How do I make the time to do something different? And I hope that a lot of people will just be like, well, because like that's what has to happen. Because there's no point in continuing to do things the way that we've been doing them because it doesn't work. So it's like, that's just wasted time. That's wasted effort. It's a very, very, very low likelihood that somebody who, once they hear something, will change their behavior. Like it's just like, there's a ton of research out there that supports this. I'm not just pulling this out of my butt. And so it's like, well, if you spend all that time doing those, developing programs that are addressing those things and nothing happens. And by the way, this is not just in the zoo and aquarium industry. Like this happens everywhere. I just happen to focus on it because that's, where my passions lie and what I saw as an opportunity to improve things. But like, for instance, like a lot of my education was focused on free choice learning, which includes zoos, aquariums, and then museums, national parks, all those things. So this happens a ton, or used to happen a ton, in museums where they would roll out like brand new exhibits. So a lot of this wasn't necessarily related to like conservation or climate change or anything like that, but they would roll out these exhibits without doing any sort of like analysis or asking like their audience what they needed, what they wanted, how they wanted to interact with things. They spend millions of dollars on an exhibit and it would tank. And then they would go in afterwards and be like, why did that happen? And it was like, well, because they didn't do the steps, right? Like they didn't actually find out like what needed to be done. So this happens all the time. So people waste time and money, but a lot of that's like pushed from other agendas. So I guess that's why I'm a little hesitant, because I don't want people to think that like just because they're not doing it means that they're doing something bad. I just hope that they can find ways to start to incorporate some of the things we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah, totally. And I think some of the things we are going to be talking about in a minute, and we'll get, if anyone's listening and you're like not quite on the same page as what we're talking about, we're going to explain that all in this next little bit. I think one thing that comes to my mind as you're talking is the work you do kind of reminds me of observations about people who want to really spread the word about positive reinforcement to animal trainers or to pet owners, and one strategy is just to share information and tell people about positive reinforcement. But then there's obviously a lot of aspects to whether a client or the audience that receives that information is actually going to go and make behaviour change with regards to how they interact with their animals. So I'm curious to just plant that seed there for you listeners to draw from what Nicolette's about to share with us and about the work she does and your job and your passion driving behaviour about spreading the word about positive reinforcement and working with pet clients and other clients that work with animals. So then to back up a little bit and acknowledge that I've said there might be some people who kind of like are following us but a little bit unsure about exactly what we're talking about. Can you tell everyone listening what you do now? What does your job entail now, and unpacks a little bit more some of the things you already mentioned?
Yeah. So I work for a company called Action Research in Oceanside, California, which is just north of San Diego. And what we focus on is using the community-based social marketing model to improve environmental programs. And what that means is we follow the steps outlined in CBSM, which we can talk about too if you want, So it's all research based. It's all has ties and foundations in social and behavioral science. So it's nothing that's just, again, like, let's just pray that this works. It utilizes all of the body of knowledge and research that's out there that impacts like how humans, especially in social situations, change. So the community base is intended to target not just an individual. So that's the one thing with the applied behavior analysis that's a little different, well, a lot different between CBSM and ABA, is that ABA is typically used on one-on-one situations or maybe small groups, but not usually on a community level, because it's kind of difficult to do like a functional assessment on like 1,000 people or something like that. So community-based social marketing brings in that piece, and it also then brings in a lot of the social science that dictates how we behave in social settings. And so what we do, I think I'll give an example. It's typically when I try to tell people what I do in my normal life, I've been trying to work on my elevator pitch because it's not easy to explain. But so like we work with municipalities a lot, or I mean, not just municipalities, but, private organizations, NGOs, what have you. And typically with some type of their environmental group. So we do a lot of stuff with San Diego County and Orange County with their watershed protection programs. So what they're trying to do is decrease stormwater pollution. And in order to do that, you need people to stop putting stuff in storm drains. And so, what we do is we look at the variety of behaviors that impact water quality, which there's a lot. And we try to figure out how we can best approach certain subsets of those so that we can see an impact on water quality. I also did some work for the International Fund for Animal Welfare on human-animal conflicts. So we're trying to look at how we can change people's behavior to avoid conflict with things like coyotes and gray seals. And then I'm also working, I guess we'll see what happens, but I'm also working with the Woodland Park Zoo on a program for wildlife trafficking with cruise ship passengers, which has taken a turn now that we have coronavirus outbreak. But anyway, so there's a variety of ways that the CBSM model can be applied. And the reason why I was so attracted to this, and I feel like a lot of people who understand and work with animals or just behavior in general, would like it, is because it's very practical and it's very linear. So it's like you do this and then you do this and then you do this and then you do this. And then at the end, it works. And it gives you measurable results, which is something that I find to be, as a scientist, something that I find to be really important and useful. And I felt like it was a really, really good fit within the zoo and aquarium world, because a lot of funding is contingent on whether or not they can prove that the program has done something. And I think for our own knowledge, I feel like a lot of us want to know, right? I mean, like I said at the very beginning, I wanted to know that what I was doing made an impact. And so when you're able to measure it, you can find that out.
So basically, one thing you're doing is working with zoos and aquariums to help the educating staff and the organisation as a whole implement a program to educate zoo visitors and actually have measurable behaviour change as part of that program, so that we can save the world.
Yeah, I mean, so it doesn't even have to be just zoo visitors. It just needs to be community. So it could be with like the community within the zoo walls, or it can be the community outside of the zoo grounds. It could be, whatever community that they're trying to address. And I think we certainly, like zoos and aquariums, certainly have different considerations than other like conservation organizations, right? So if there's a conservation organization that's going out into a particular community where an animal's being impacted from poaching or something, and they're doing, something with that community, the CBSM model works really well there. But then when you bring it into zoos and aquariums, sometimes people don't know how to use it the right way because it's still new. And like I said, it's different than the way things used to be done. And I'm actually working on quick side note, I'm actually working on some materials that will be available for free to zoo, well, to anybody, but it's specific to zoo and aquarium practitioners who are interested in applying this theory and this model into their programming. And what it does is it translates what has been done before. So Doug Mackenzie Moore is the founder. He's the author of community-based social marketing, and his focus has been on sustainability. And so a lot of that has included things like how do utility companies get people to reduce their energy usage? And this happens then at businesses. So there's been a big focus on that sector. There's been a big focus on recycling, trash, food waste, that type of things. And while they're parallel, they're not exactly the same as conservation initiatives. So what I'm doing is I'm translating a lot of those programs into things that are a little bit more, relevant to people working in conservation, so that they're able to see. I think the best way to understand this is typically to have a case study and to read oh, this is how we did this. So I'm translating that stuff so that'll be available hopefully soon-ish.
So then you came into this with your background in ABA, and you identified that it's hard to do a functional analysis on a group of 1,000 people. So the CBSM, so community-based social marketing model, was a tool that you reached for to help with that larger population size. So can you help us understand a little bit more about what CBSM is, and how do CBSM and ABA have things in common, and what do they have in common, and maybe use the lens of the listeners of the show understanding more about ABA to help you explain CBSM. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the reason why I was interested in CBSM is because there was a lot of similarities between CBSM and ABA, and it's very linear. So instead of just guessing about a behavior, the first thing that you do in the CBSM process is to select a behavior to promote, and which is the same in ABA, which is to select a target behavior. And the thing that I think people need to keep in mind, especially when they're trying to select a behavior, is that it's not just a behavior that you choose out of thin air. It needs to be a behavior that is going to actually have an impact on the goal. So I think this could be a really helpful experiment, or whatever you want to call it, for people who are working in the field, if they want to think back to what is the purpose of asking people to recycle, for instance. And if the purpose really is to increase habitat for a specific type of animal, it would be better to find out what specifically is impacting habitat loss for that animal, and then break it down from there. So instead of saying okay, we're just going to encourage people to recycle generally, which by the way can still be done. I'm not advocating that people stop kind of using these generalities, but I think there needs to be a conscious effort that we aren't saying that those things are then impacting behavior. So you can say yes, we promote recycling, we promote composting, we promote reducing single-use plastics, we promote all these things. But if you're really talking about how you're changing behavior, it needs to be more specific. And so that's the beginning of CBSM that I feel especially as behaviorists, that a lot of people would love, because what it does is it gives you a much better direction from the beginning. So if your goal is to increase habitat for X animal, you start looking at all the components that feed into the habitat loss, and you figure out then which ones of those things which ones of those are human-caused behaviors, and which ones of those things can have the biggest impact on increasing habitat loss. And not to get too far into the weeds with this, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to be targeting the one thing that has the biggest impact, because sometimes that's not possible for a variety of reasons. But then you're able to do these other analyses to kind of determine, okay, if we can't do the top behavior, maybe there's a couple other behaviors that we can work on that would still have a high impact. And this is all going to be in that translation that I'm working on. So to get back to the similarities between CBSM and ABA. So when you first start by selecting the behavior to promote, and you do that with ABAs, you identify a target behavior. then what you start to look at is, so once you've identified what that particular behavior is, then you start identifying barriers. And a barrier is something that is preventing people from engaging in the behavior. And this is very similar to identifying controlling contingencies. So you want to find out why the behavior is occurring, or why it's not occurring. And you want to do this for the target behavior, so the behavior that you want to promote, as well as the behavior that you're trying to discourage. So just like in any sort of behavior program, what you'll do is you basically reduce the response, what word am I looking for? Response effort. There it is. I'll get there. You want to reduce the response effort for the desired behavior, right? So we bring down barriers. When we're training animals, we say, how do we make this easier for an animal to do? And then you increase the response effort for the opposite behavior. You do basically similar things for people. It's different because it's not quite the same controlled environment, but you're doing essentially the same thing. So what this requires is you have to talk to people. You can't just make an assumption. So again, it goes back to, we're not making assumptions. You're not choosing a behavior based off of what you think is the most important or the most impactful, but you actually do the research behind that. And then the same thing with the barriers. You actually ask the people who are not engaging in the behavior, why they're not engaging in the behavior. I mean, that's the real basic part of it. Then once you've had those identified, so barriers, what we do is a barrier and benefit analysis. So we look at what those barriers are, and then we also look at what the benefits are. So like, why would somebody want to engage in behavior? And so typically what you want to do is you want to reduce the barriers and increase the benefits. And doing those things tends to push people over towards that side. And then once you are able to identify what the barriers and benefits are, the next step is to develop strategies. And this is typically where people start. And this is the third step in the CBSM process. And it's really important that strategies aren't developed before you identify the behavior or before you understand what those barriers and benefits are. Because the way that you develop a strategy, an effective strategy, is dependent on what the barriers and benefits are to the behavior. So there's no use in developing an educational campaign. So a barrier could be knowledge. I mentioned that previously. But there's no use in developing an educational campaign if you find out that that's not a barrier, right? So if you do the audience research and you find out that everybody's pretty aware of recycling and that they should recycle, if you do an education campaign, if you develop that, what's happening? Nothing. So in this case, if you identified something else, this is when you would develop the strategy. And this is actually the fun part. So selecting the behavior and identifying the barriers and benefits can be a little, there's a lot of like gray area, and there's kind of a lot of, you kind of feel like you're in the dark a little bit in terms of like, well, what does this mean? But as you go through these steps and as you uncover the barriers and benefits, it becomes very clear what strategies to use. And in Doug Mackenzie Moore's book, so Fostering Sustainable Behavior, which you can access on his website for free, or you can buy it. I think he has a link on his webpage. You can also get it on Amazon. But then he outlines a variety of different strategies that can be used for different barriers. So if you have a specific type of barrier, there would be a specific type of strategy that you would employ. And I won't get into all of those right now. But what's really cool about that is that, like I said, well, for me, it was very much related to how I've always trained animals, right? So like when you start recognizing what the issues were, you overcome that issue with the animal instead of just like, I don't know, sticking to a training plan that's not working, right? Like no one does that because it doesn't work. So when you're developing a program that's addressing barriers and focus on the target behavior, that's like developing an intervention strategy that mitigates existing controlling contingencies and creates other contingencies to support the target behavior. So that's that ABA CBSM relationship. So then after you develop the strategy, you want to conduct a pilot. And a lot of times people don't always take the time to do this step either, which doesn't necessarily have to be anything crazy. But the reason why you want to pilot your strategies is because if you roll out an entire program that you think is going to do what you want it to do, and it doesn't, and you've spent all of the money in the budget and you've used all the resources, and it fails, then it feels like, the CBSM process failed or whatever, you failed or these behavior change strategies don't work. But the reality is that like sometimes we just miss things, right? Because it's not a perfect science because it's a practical situation. And so it's really important to pilot these things and to make any tweaks to the pilot based off of the feedback you get in a smaller scale. And then once that's been done, then you do a broad scale implementation. So that's like the 5th step in the process. Yeah. So what do you think after hearing that?
So a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Is part of the start process kind of figuring out what behaviors people are doing instead of the behavior you want them to do and the functions behind those behaviors, or is that not part of the process?
It can be for sure. So, typically what you want to do is you want to focus on the target behavior. So you say, okay, we want people to do this thing. So I'm just finishing a project on pet waste. They want people to pick up after their pets. So we've actually done quite a few of those projects here at Action Research. And so what we've done is we go out and ask people why they don't do it. Like, why don't you pick up after your pets? And not surprising, it's not because they don't know. It's because they don't have bags or there's not a trash can or, they just don't care. They don't realize maybe how that impacts waterways or it contaminates other things. Like there's a variety of reasons why people don't do it. And it's not just because they don't know that they should pick up after their pets. And so what we do is then we focus on that and then also find out like what would motivate them to do it, which are those benefits. And we kind of highlight those. So a lot of it's like social norming language. We say, a lot of times people in the community are like, oh, I really value keeping my watersheds healthy or my waterways clean or my lake clean or my river, like whatever it is that's valuable to the community. So we'll say something like 75% or 85% of the community thinks it's important to protect our waterways. One way you can do that is by cleaning up after your pet. But then instead of just like providing this information, we create programs that go out into the communities and actually help change the behavior. So hand out pet waste bags, have them sign commitments to picking up their pet waste. So that's like a way to increase motivation. Things like that. But it is important then on the other hand, so for projects like trying to encourage people to carpool, for instance, or to use alternative modes of transportation, it is important to understand why they're doing the other thing. Like why are people driving in their cars by themselves and not riding a bike or not carpooling? So it's it just depends sort of on the behavior.
All right. So imagine that I'm working at a zoo or an aquarium or a museum or any other organisation that tries to encourage behaviour change. And I want, let's talk specifically about people that work with animals actually. And I'm someone who does education. So I'm listening to this podcast, I'm driving to work. I know that let's firstly say some of the things you've said today have kind of struck a chord with me. And I realised that, and by the way, in saying this, listeners of the show, if you're the person that I'm talking about right now, I'm guilty of these things in my career. So,
me too.
It's nothing to feel bad about. But we know that we're going to go and talk to visitors today, and we've got a program that hasn't been through these steps. We don't actually know what specific behaviours we want to target, and we're kind of doing an education campaign maybe that doesn't need to be done because people are already aware of the things we're talking about. What are some things that I can do when I get to work today to try to help me be successful and ensure that I am self-caring and acknowledging some cognitive dissonance that might occur throughout my day?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do have a couple of things that I would like to suggest that people start doing or look into doing. And I also want to caveat this with, two things. One, I recognize that this is exactly the same situation. Like I'm saying, like, here, let me tell you all this information and then like do something different. So I know that that's not how this works. Like I said, it could be a barrier to changing things, but I would love to be able to do a CBSM project on this, which is, kind of in the works, collecting data. So I understand that there's challenges to this, right? So a lot of it's institutional support. It's, not feeling like you have a voice or not having a voice when you're developing programming. And so I just want to, acknowledge that there are many reasons why some of these things might not be able to happen. But if you can be the, voice for change at your institution, and you need support in doing that, please reach out to me because I am happy to provide that. And I work closely with Doug Mackenzie Moore and the president here at Action Research, Jennifer Tabanico. The three of us are, working on developing these materials for zoos and aquariums because we recognize the need that exists and because we know how important it is to these professionals to be making a positive impact on wildlife. So there is support. I can help. I would suggest looking into Doug Mackenzie Moore's book. So the CBSM, it's Fostering Sustainable Behavior is the title, and it's an introduction to community-based social marketing. I would recommend that because it's a really good foundation to understand how this works. And especially if you, dig behavior like I dig behavior, I think you'll really appreciate all of the behavioral science that's incorporated. And it just it makes a lot of sense. It's very linear, analytical. It makes sense. And it gives you a good roadmap. So it can be a little overwhelming because it's a lot, but it's a good resource. And then there's also trainings that Doug provides and that we also provide here at Action Research that we're happy to do on any level. So if that's something that could be useful, do that. Besides those things, if you're currently working on a program, one of the things that I would recommend is limiting the number of asks that you are providing in a program. So what I found when I did my thesis research is that there are a lot of behavior asks in a program. So when I observed a bunch of different programs across, summer camp programs, 10-minute trainer talks, carnivore feed, all those different things. In addition to the years that I've done all of those things and watched my coworkers and peers do it too. And, there tends to be a list of things that is given to people. And I would recommend that list gets shortened to 2 or 3 behaviors tops. This is not in lieu of doing a CBSM program. So the most effective way to do this is to start at the very beginning, like I mentioned earlier. But, for this interim, how can you improve something now? Just start thinking about what behavior is actually the most impactful, which of those behaviors are most impactful, and give them a couple of things to do. And this is true not just because it's bad practice, but because there's been some evidence that shows that people have this decision paralysis. So if you give them too many things to pick from, they don't pick anything. And the last thing we want people to do is nothing. So that's one way you can start to improve that. And the other thing that I would recommend is to do some sort of audience research. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It doesn't have to be super intense. It can just be, pretty quick and dirty, but asking people why they aren't doing something, right? And something that is important to understand is that the barriers, so the reason why someone's not doing something, vary at the level of the behavior. So even if you have related behaviors, so recycling, composting, things like that kind of fall into that same category. The reason why somebody doesn't recycle at their office, the reason why somebody doesn't recycle at their home, the reason why people don't recycle plastic versus paper, that all is different. So you can't assume that it's just all the same. And then the reason why people aren't recycling is different from the reason why people aren't composting. And keeping that in mind is really important. And the way that you can kind of tease some of that stuff out is asking people. So if you want them to reduce their single-use plastics, I would narrow that down to a type and then figure out, well, why don't they do that? And, some of these programs, some of these things can't be accomplished necessarily in the confines of a 10-minute trainer talk. And so that might not be a good candidate for that program. But if you start doing these things, first of all, it's really interesting because I've learned all kinds of stuff. I was I never even thought about that, but that makes sense. And so it's interesting, but then it also starts moving things in the right direction. So we're just moving the needle a little bit. So those are my suggestions.
So, I mean, a lot of what you're saying for me, it makes me just think to the listeners of the show that aren't working in zoos but are working with dog clients and appreciating when we're thinking about dogs, for example, or someone doing zoo consultancy working with horses. The reason why a dog barks at home might be different to the reason a dog barks at the park or a dog barks in the car. And the reason one owner does the targeting, air quotes, homework you give them is different than why another owner does the homework you give them or doesn't. So it does have applications. I just love that all of this stuff is kind of the same. No matter, like,
absolutely,
we can think about all of this with regards to what we do and trying to get behavior change from our clients.
Oh yeah, and actually, I started. We haven't worked together yet, but I started a proposal for a company. I'm not sure if they want me to say their name, so I'm not going to. But that they work with horse trainers, and when I presented at ABMA last year, they were interested because they were running into the same problem, which was like, well, how do we train horse trainers to train horses with positive reinforcement, right? Because it's something that the horse trainers have to change their behavior in order for that to improve the practice for horse training. And so we've been in talks with how to use these principles on their clients, essentially, right? So how do they have this bigger reach? And it's the exact same process. So you can use this, pretty much anywhere because it's like I said, it's based in behavioral and social science. So those things are applicable across everything.
All right. ATA podcast listeners, we're going to do some CBSM on you. I don't even know what the behaviors are, but I'm curious to explore how we can help you be more efficient podcast listeners or digesters of content or whatever behavior we decide on. Sadly, we are nearly at the end. I want to say thank you to you for your offer for people to reach out to you. That's really kind. We'll put a link to ways to contact Nicolette in the show notes. Also want to acknowledge, I think this is the first time in this episode coronavirus has been mentioned on this show. It's creeping its way into everywhere, which is really interesting. We are sadly, however, at the end though. We do have one more question that we would love to get your input on, please, Nicolette, before we wrap up. And I'm really curious to know, and with your experience, with your knowledge, and with the line of work that you do and what you see and your vision, what do you want to see happen over the next 5 to 10 years? I want to say in the animal training, including humans, in the earthling training world, and the behavior science world. Where do you see all of this going over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I love this question. I am really encouraged by the things that I'm seeing, and there has been a lot more focus on how to start incorporating research and science into improving programming specific to behavior change. And so I think that it's headed in the right direction. I think that people are certainly looking for direction right now. So it is a little bit, clumsy, a little bit dark, everyone's trying to figure out, what the next step is and where they're going. But I think that what will happen is especially once some of the executives at these institutions realize what an untapped resource they have in their animal training staff and their animal husbandry staff, I think they're going to say, oh, we can do this because we have this wealth of knowledge, these passionate people who are willing to do whatever they need to do to improve the welfare of the animals in their care, but also for wildlife. And so I think what's going to happen is we're going to see this huge sea change in terms of what the focus is for most zoos and aquariums. It's already happening, right? We've shifted the focus away from a lot of the entertainment type of things into conservation, and we make huge impacts on a lot of conservation initiatives every year. So I think that that's just going to keep happening. And I think once we're able to effectively collaborate across institutions, then it'll be really, really amazing. So no one's having to reinvent the wheel anymore because we can learn from each other and our mistakes and our successes. So that's what I hope to see happen. And I think that's where it's going. Fingers crossed.
Well, hopefully this episode has created some ripples and educating people that might not be aware of this, and Spatial providing some more tools. And I love that you said that hopefully the people sitting in the driving seats, the executives, will realise what an untapped resource we have in our animal care and animal training staff. And I just have this feeling that, as you say, the world, to get meta on you, because I know you like doing that, the world will acknowledge what a resource we have in our animal behaviour and human behaviour and just behaviour. Educated and skilled personnel to do what we didn't really articulate in this podcast, but what the topic that Nicolette and I came up with when we talked last week, what the topic of this episode is to build upon our skill set at consciously applying the laws of behaviour science to help save the world. Any final thoughts on that before we wrap up, Nicolette?
I think that's I like that topic idea that we came up with. I think that's just what it is. I think it's like I don't know if this motivates people, but, a challenge to see how you can apply what you know from a behavioral standpoint to things that are impacting, the community in a positive way and wildlife. So build on those skill sets. Find out the answers. What term did you use about being curious? I like that. Be curious. Ask questions.
I love that you chose that as your final thought. Resonates with me a lot. We didn't actually say anywhere in the episode, we normally do, so I apologise for this, where people can go to find out more specific URLs and websites and social media. So can you share that with us now, Nicolette? Where can people go who want to find out more information about what you guys are currently doing and / or any future projects?
Yeah. So the CBSM.com is Doug Mackenzie Moore's site, and it has a bunch of resources for people who are working in a lot of different sustainability projects. And it includes that link to his book that you can read for free there. And if you want to check us out, we're at Action 3630, the number 3630.com. And we have a bunch of different things on our webpage that show what projects we've been up to, a little bit more about us as a team, that kind of stuff. But if you are interested in other resources, if you'd like to have the zoo and aquarium, the conservation-focused introduction to CBSM, send me an email, and I can put you on my list to send that out once it's ready.
Cool. Where should people send that email to?
Outer space. I will say it, but this is my last name, but we can put a link to it. So it's Canzoneri, CANZ as in zebra, ONERI at actionresearch-inc.com.
Wonderful. We'll link to that and we'll put it in the show notes as well in case you didn't have a pen and paper and you're driving.
Yeah.
Do not do the behaviour of trying to write that down.
Yeah, don't do that.
So we will link to all of the stuff in the show notes today. As mentioned, Nicolette, this has been so much fun. So from myself and on behalf of, I want to say, all of the lucky zoo, museum, conservation-based organisation visitors who benefit from the listeners of this show listening to this episode today, and for everyone listening, we really appreciate everything you do to help save the world, and also for taking time to come and hang out with us here at Animal Training Academy today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was so fun.
We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and you were interested in carrying on the conversation about working with our animals in the most positive, funnest, choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behaviour geeks. There's something there for absolutely everyone, and we're looking forward to having you join the tribe. That's it for this episode though. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much everyone for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.